Provost, Lord Bandside, Lady Paisley, ladies and gentlemen, we will never know how many people died in the massacres that began 369 years ago tonight. The 1641 Depositions Project, completed on time, on budget and above specification, and which is unveiled to the whole world today, answers many of the questions we've always had about the nature of the Irish Rebellion and the massacres that accompanied it. But as Aidan Clarke insisted last year in his memorable lecture in Dublin Castle, marking the end of one phase of this project, we cannot answer the question we would most like to answer. How many people were killed and how many died of exposure and shock after being driven from their homes stark naked into biting winter weather? Aidan Clarke also demonstrated for us that there was no intention of a general massacre, no pre-planned slaughter of British planters. His case studies indicate a slow build-up, but although he refused to put any numbers on it, he did not undermine the view that this was the greatest recorded sustained massacre in the recorded history of these islands. My own preliminary work on the depositions has led me to one conclusion above all. I found that we need to keep quite separate the moral economy of violence clearly and consistently to be found in eyewitness testimony within the depositions from the very different hearsay testimony in those same depositions. The distinction is generally very clearly drawn. Sworn eyewitness testimony, after all, could be used in the intended trials of rebels, even if the deponent subsequently died or could not be found. Hearsay could not be so used. This eyewitness testimony speaks of a determination of the rebels to strip British Protestants of all that they had, to take away all that was of value and to destroy the rest, and routinely to strip those British Protestants of their clothes and often, perhaps normally, stripping them stark naked, either because the clothes have their own value or surely mainly as a form of ritual humiliation. Many, many men, women and children stripped and humiliated, often more than once, staggered out into the bitter cold and died. Where there was resistance, there was violence, often resulting in death. But in the eyewitness testimony, that violence was immediate and aimed at ending resistance. Weapons of war, guns, clubs, swords were used to subdue or to kill. But there is very, very little eyewitness evidence of torture, mutilation and sexual violence. And violent death is gendered disproportionately of adult males. And the level of resistance and of killing escalated over time and came to contain a stronger element of revenge as Protestants organised counterinsurgency and started killing rebels in their turn. But when we consider what is clearly signalled as hearsay evidence, then we get a very different moral economy in which violence is gratuitous, sexualised, graphic in its depiction of torture, slow, excruciating death, mutilation, affecting women and children disproportionately. This deposition, the deposition of Philip Taylor of Portadown, is brief and to the point. There is evidence of killing on a grand scale at the outset, but dare I say it, uncomplicated killing. Only in the hearsay do we get one of the great tropes confined to the hearsay. A pregnant woman, her belly ripped open and her unborn twins thrown into a ditch to be eaten by pigs. My own reading, principally of Ulster depositions so far, leads me to other tentative conclusions. That in the eyewitness testimony, Catholic clergy are more often than not portrayed as striving to place a limit on the violence, but in the hearsay, they are always urging rebels on to acts of extreme brutality. That the rebellion was begun by elements in the Irish elite who quickly lost control of the people they led and sought desperately to regain control of a movement that span out of their control. And that the disastrous and invented claims of Sir Phelim O'Neill that he possessed a warrant under the Scottish seal of King Charles I for the disarming of the Protestant community, That claim spread like wildfire among the Protestant community and back to England, where it played a vital role in reinforcing the trust of many of those who were to fight against the king a few months later. Richard Baxter is simply the best known of a whole series of people whose allegiance was substantially based on O'Neill's false claims. Within 10 weeks of the rebellion breaking out, the Lords Justices in Dublin established a mechanism for recording its consequences. Initially planned as inventories of goods taken or destroyed, it soon became in addition a record of acts of violence. And within a few weeks of this process starting, the contents of the sworn depositions of survivors were being leaked into the English press. In the first 9 months after the rebellion, more than 250 pamphlets relating to the rebellion and to the massacres were published. That's a quarter of all publications in that period. And in the crucial months of February, March and April 1642, more than a third of all titles related to the massacres. And these were the very months during which the English Parliament was pondering its response. There were several sources of information for these pamphleteers. The first was the evidence of survivors who crossed to Britain and seemed to have told stories similar to those in the depositions. The second was the depositions themselves. Most important was the digest of the early depositions prepared by Henry Jones, who Jane mentioned, Dean of Kilmore, and 7 other commissioners. That digest, that published digest, had 2 intentions: to make the case for a planned general massacre of the English Protestant communities in Ireland, and to portray the violence in its most extreme form. It drew heavily on the hearsay testimony. This digest was prepared for and was presented to the English House of Commons in early March 1642 and was ordered to be published. It was just in time to influence opinion in favour of the Adventurers Bill, to which we'll turn in a moment. Thus, English responses were based more on misinformation than on a balanced account of what had happened and was happening. In the weeks on either side of Jones's remonstrance, we get many pamphlets which draw heavily on deposition material. In 10 pamphlets that I've examined in detail so far from these crucial months, more than 90% of all citations from the depositions relate to hearsay accounts of atrocity, less than 10% to eyewitness accounts. And with the exception of Jones's pamphlets, most pad out with material from 2 other sources: horror pamphlets of confessional violence from the German theatre of the 30 Years' War, recycled into Ireland, and anti-Catholic material that had been freely available in England in the 1630s, and stories of extreme cruelty and depraved violence adapted from and evocative of John Fox's Acts and Monuments, or the Book of Martyrs, the most widely owned and widely read book in Elizabethan and early Stuart England after the Bible. Some stories seem to have been pure invention, including the much repeated story of a non-existent Sir Patrick Dunstan, forced to watch his wife being raped before he was slowly and imaginatively tortured to death. These stories too played on memories of past alleged Catholic atrocity. An unrepresentative few of the pamphlets were graphically illustrated with pictures more distressing and violent than anything we will be allowed to see on the media today. Here is a familiar image from one such pamphlet, The Tears from Ireland, in which the herding of naked men and women, some falling by the wayside, is vividly portrayed. And this is a more distressing scene, but I've spared you the worst. You can see them in the exhibition. Now, here's the one that gives the game away. This is part of the same sequence, purports to show men inconsequentially shooting down herring gulls over Dublin. But I appeal to your superior knowledge here. Does this look like Dublin? Or does it look like Magdeburg, sacked a few years earlier? And here, in fact, we see the recycling of redundant continental woodcuts to meet the new atrocity hotspot. The events of the winter of 1641-2, especially as misrepresented, required an immediate British military response. Refugees flocked to Dublin and other ports and thence to England and to Scotland. The Scots, since they were in the process of demobilising the troops that had invaded England, were able to get men to the north of Ireland first, with a promise, which of course was never honoured, that they'd be paid by the English to do it. With England collapsing into civil war and no trust between the king and a majority of parliamentarians, agreement to raise taxes for an Irish expedition simply was non-existent. And so the Parliament proposed a radical and unprecedented scheme. The Act for the Speedy and Effectual Reducing of the Rebels in Ireland passed its final parliamentary vote in late March 1642 at the height of the pamphlets and after Jones's remonstrance. It provided for the raising of loans to deploy an army to protect survivors of the massacre and to repress the rebellion. That loan to be repaid from the confiscation of Irish land. As the first clause of the Act puts it, 2.5 million of acres be assigned, allotted and divided amongst them that adventure money in that cause. 2.5 million acres. The Adventurers Act was, in fact, an early exercise in venture capitalism and an anticipation of modern lottery culture. Some individuals tried their luck on their own, advancing anything from £5 to £2,400. But many, and I think a lot more than has been realised, invested as a syndicate. Sir William Brereton, MP, soon to be Major General in the Parliamentarian Army in the North Midlands, invested £900. But he was investing on behalf of himself and a group of Cheshire Puritans, including 2 of his future local officials and 2 separatist clergymen. I found other examples, and I'm sure this must have been the case for Oliver Cromwell, whose investment of £600 was above what he could possibly afford on an annual income of £200. Investing in Ireland was almost certainly one of the things that bonded together what was soon to be syndicates of war party Puritans in a war of the 3 kingdoms against Charles I. The adventurers struggled to keep their cause at the centre of the nation's attention across the 1640s. As war spread across these islands, and as the ebb and flow of war in Britain was matched by stalemate in Ireland, resources were always prioritised elsewhere. But a parliamentarian victory would reawaken demands for a renewed campaign to restore British control of Ireland. With this in view, as Parliament mapped out its post-war settlement, Sir John Temple, who had been Master of the Rolls in Dublin in 1641, published The Irish Rebellion, or An History of the Beginning and First Progress of the General Rebellion raised within the Kingdom of Ireland, together with the barbarous cruelties and bloody massacres which ensued thereupon. And as the late 19th century, early 20th century historian Robert Dunlop wrote, this book made an immediate and great sensation and did much to inflame popular indignation in England and against the Irish, and to justify the severe treatment afterwards measured out to them by Cromwell. It kept memory of the massacres and hopes of the adventurers very alive. No less than 119 MPs had invested in the adventure, all of whom were subsequently parliamentarians, and they were disproportionately represented in the rump of the Long Parliament that was in power after the regicide. Many more were London businessmen whose successive regimes needed to keep on side as they struggled with budget deficits proportionately worse than those in these islands today. And I know that's a big claim, but I'm confident it's true. Though nobody will pay me in the next year or two to prove it. They kept the pressure up for the reconquest of Ireland to be prioritised. You can see how serious they are about digging in for a long term when they appointed as their spokesperson a man called Methuselah Turner. And of course it was a long haul. The wars within and between the three kingdoms only allowed priority to be given to the English conquest of Ireland once Charles I had been executed, and then it became a priority. Now, the English state could set out the English state could set out an army with the resources of men, cash, and munitions, including siege guns to breach medieval walls and modern earthworks never available before in this island, that had produced an ebb and flow of war but no decisive action across the 1640s. So the result is the famous or infamous Cromwellian conquest and Cromwellian settlement. I hope to surprise you a little in the remainder of this paper by rethinking the second of those, the Cromwellian settlement. Cromwell began the military conquest of Ireland, but he was needed in Scotland and others completed it. I can only repeat here what I have argued elsewhere. That is Oliver Cromwell in the National Portrait Gallery in London thinks that it's a Dutch painting showing him at Drogheda. That there's quite a good reasoning for it, and I've not seen that picture before in that form. So here's Cromwell, and at Drogheda, which he stormed, over 3,500 were killed. The vast majority, including at least 800 civilians, were killed in hot blood as Cromwell's troops stormed through the town. And a minority, all of them soldiers or religious, were killed in cold blood, knocked on the head, as Cromwell put it, which I take it means he was sparing his bullets for other occasions. In his own words, those slain, this is the pamphlet. In his own words, those slain included foot soldiers. I need to go on one. Yeah, it's there. 2,500 foot soldiers, besides staff officers, surgeons, and many inhabitants. But this does not mean that civilians were killed in cold blood, only in hot. Cromwell's justification of this, printed as he intended in Dublin and in London, was that this slaughter was a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who've imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood, and that it will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future, which are the satisfactory grounds of such actions, which otherwise cannot but work remorse and regret. This was from the letter to the Speaker of the House of Commons, and he knew it would be published. In a letter to the President of the Council of State, which he would not expect to be published, he repeats the second but not the first justification. Truly I believe this bitterness will save much effusion of blood through the goodness of God. So this was his Hiroshima moment, and soon at Wexford he was to have his Nagasaki moment. And it did prevent the effusion of blood. In his public letter, he also speaks of the righteous judgment of God. Yet he knew that there were effectively no Confederate troops in Drogheda. This was a royalist town full of Ormondist troops. In his letter to the President of the Council of State, he makes clear that the 8 regimental commanders were mainly English and Catholic. They were the ones he lists first in his catalogue of the slain. They're the ones he puts first in his catalogue of the slain. And it was their heads he displayed outside Dublin. It's possible, I say no more, that the barbarous wretches at Drogheda were the English Catholics seeking to resurrect a lost cause in Ireland, and not the Irish themselves. If that is so, Drogheda was not a slow burn reaction for the massacres of 1641. And so Cromwell moved remorselessly on, securing the whole of the East Coast and most of Leinster and Munster in 9 relentless months. When he offered generous terms, as at Clonmel, after losing 2,000 men in a botched storm of the town, he honoured his articles to the letter. 4 months later, after Drogheda, the Catholic bishops and other clergy met at Clonmacnoise and called for a supreme national uprising to drive out Cromwell, who had come, they said, to extirpate Irish Catholics and Irish Catholicism. Cromwell issued a scornful rebuttal, much quoted, but always misunderstood. What is invariably quoted is a much altered London printing with a different title, The Declaration of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland for the Undeceiving of Deluded and Seduced People. But it was preceded by this, one of 2 Irish printings, identical Irish printings. These Irish printings first give the decrees of the Irish clergy and then rebut them. Cromwell displayed a profound anti-clericalism, and he was scornful about Catholic forms of worship, especially the Mass, and he promised to make Ireland as free of priests as it was of snakes. But he also made it clear that no Catholic would have his or her conscience compelled, and that there would be no forced conversion or even forced attendance at Protestant worship. And he also protested that he had not come over to undertake a vast expropriation, let alone a programme of ethnic cleansing. Certainly one of his priorities was to see the adventurers rewarded, for when, by your execrable massacre and rebellion, you had not only raised a bloody war to justify the same, was it not fit to make their estates to defray the charge of reconquest who had caused the trouble? Yet at the same time, those who laid down their arms will be treated with justice and mercy. Those, and he specifies nobility, gentry and commons, those not involved in the original rebellion will be protected, as he puts it, in their goods, liberties and lives. He speaks of fines, as in the case of English royalists and English Catholics, excepting only the leading persons and principal contrivers of the rebellion, whom I am confident the Parliament will reserve to make examples of justice. This, he made clear, would create more than enough to satisfy the adventurers. For many years I thought he was lying, that he was trying to give the Catholics a false sense of security. But now I think he was telling the truth, that he did expect and that he continued to advocate a much more moderate settlement than the one which bears his name, the Cromwellian settlement, and its motto, to hell or Connaught. I believe that he opposed the Act for the Settlement of Ireland of August 1652, that he was removed as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland to prepare the way for that settlement, and as Lord Protector he strove with some success to mitigate the more extreme aspects of that settlement. The settlement of 1652 was rooted in changing military realities and in the escalating arrears of the English army that could only be paid off in Irish land, as much as it was rooted in vengeance for 1641. This is the architect of the 1652 settlement. This is Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law, left in charge of Ireland when Cromwell was recalled to invade Scotland. It's a great mistake to think that he and Oliver were agreed on most things. They were seriously at odds in the run-up to the regicide, for example. Ireton was naturally tougher than Cromwell, from the outset offering less generous terms to towns that he besieged. He struck a commemorative medal to mark his governorship in Ireland. It consisted of a battle raging in the background and a soldier setting fire to a thatched roof of an Irish peasant cottage in the foreground. And the slogan, translated from Latin, reads, "Justice and necessity commanded it." Within months of taking over, Ireton had most towns under his control. Only Limerick and Galway remained to be taken. But he was faced by a new problem. Many thousands of Tories and woodkern who had taken to the woods and the bogs and were preparing for a long war of attrition on overstretched English supply lines. The English were to find in Ireland in the 1650s, as they have found in Afghanistan in recent years, that superior technology and a striving to win hearts and minds is not enough. So, in a document that closely prefigured the 1652 Act, Ireton proposed the mass expropriation of everyone who'd been involved in rebellion in 1641 and of many acts since, and of those who set up or led the Confederation of Kilkenny, as well as a long list of named persons exempt from pardon, and all those Catholic clergy deemed corporately guilty of preaching rebellion. More dramatically, it was Ireton who first proposed the mass movement of Catholics and Irish Protestant royal and some Irish Protestant royalists who were to be fined but not executed, and to be moved to an as yet unspecified part of Ireland. He even made a start with a dramatic scheme to clear not only the Tories but all inhabitants of the area between the Barrow and the Suir, and to settle a regiment of demobilised New Model veterans commanded by Colonel George Lawrence in and around Waterford. Ireton died of exhaustion in December 1651 after the capture of Limerick, and historians have lost sight of his responsibility for the settlement of 1652. What followed was a titanic and unnoticed struggle in London between what I will call the Cromwellian and the Iretonian visions of settlement. At issue was whether it should be a minimalist Cromwellian settlement, the careful calculation of how much land was needed to satisfy the adventurers and the unpaid soldiers, and the confiscation of just enough land to satisfy those demands, together with a strict observance of all the promises made by Cromwell and others that had persuaded the Confederate armies and garrisons to surrender on terms, or whether it would be an Iretonian settlement that would aim to put on trial and execute tens of thousands of rebels, transport tens of thousands more into exile on the continent or to indentured servitude in the Barbados, and to remove the remaining royalists, and especially Catholic royalists, from 28 Irish counties into just 4, Clare, Galway, Mayo and Roscommon. The first of several crises around these alternative visions occurred in mid-May 1652, at a time when Cromwell was being worsted in vote after vote on the constitutional settlement, on the extent of religious liberty, on indemnity for former royalists in England and Wales, for example. So in mid-May 1652 was the Rump Parliament, heavily lobbied by the commissioners in Ireland, by the adventurers, not least those within the House itself, and by Republicans with agendas of their own, found itself caught between two strategies, suddenly and without warning. In those circumstances, the Rump abolished Cromwell's Lord Lieutenancy of Ireland. This was scheduled for a routine renewal several weeks later, but on the 19th of May they did two things. They ordered Cromwell to go to Dover to inspect the fleet. This was the only time between his return from Worcester in September 1651, his death 8 years later, the only time that he left London. He was ordered out, and then as soon as he was riding out of town, they abolished his office of Lord Lieutenant. It was a bitterly divisive and was passed by only 39 votes to 37. It cannot be coincidental that in the midst of all this, in the very week of the vote to strip Cromwell of his Lord Lieutenancy, our old friend Henry Jones, principal commissioner for the depositions relating to the massacres, he resurfaced. He provided the commissioners in Dublin with a digest of the depositions, once more sensationalising them, and the Rump immediately ordered their publication. An abstract of some few of the massacres and murders of the Protestants in some parts of Ireland. This can't be a coincidence, and it may have swung critical votes that cost Cromwell his Lord Lieutenancy. While stirring up memories of the massacre, the Rump then imposed a news blackout so that their decision was not reported. The following day, the same group who had banished Cromwell to Dover and ended his power in Ireland tried to push through an immediate Iretonian Irish settlement, but this time they were thwarted by 34 votes to 32. The result was stalemate and inevitably a reference to a slow-acting committee. When it finally reported in early August, two parallel settlements were proposed. One Cromwellian, defeated on the 11th of August, and another Iretonian, to promote and one Iretonian, to promote the act that we know as an act for the settling of Ireland. The act that proposed mass expropriation, mass execution, and to hell or Connaught, rushed through all three readings in 24 hours on the 11th and 12th of August. Once again, Cromwell is to be found on the mild side, and once again he was outvoted, and the act of settlement shot through. What's more, on the very day that the House read the House read the humble petition of the army, including requests for settlement in Ireland, in which all articles of war to the enemy may be made good according to the intent of them. And the army petition was kicked into the long grass. To secure the rapid surrender of garrisons across Ireland, army commanders had offered generous terms that would subvert the intentions of the Act of Settlement. This, like his promises in his declaration, was non-negotiable for Cromwell and his men. A legislative battle was won, but the war over the Irish settlement was just beginning. It took a year for the commissioners, a body from which frantic efforts were made to remove Cromwell's name, to come up with detailed schedules for placing all Irish Catholics and some Protestants into the various categories of guilt, all that is above the status of husbandman. And they were all to be placed in their category of guilt according to their respective demerits, as the Act of Settlement had it, and to publish them. And it took until late 1653 for an act for the speedy and effectual satisfaction of the adventurers for lands in Ireland and of the arrears of soldiery there to be passed. Another act Cromwell tried to subvert. And so into the grim endgame, as the sheer impossibility of using legal process to sort out those who were to lose their lives from those who were to be exiled, from those who were to have their lives protected, to separate out those who lose everything from those who lose 2/3 to those who lose 1/3, to the administrative nightmare of redistributing land and moving the Irish to Connaught. It was beyond the resources of the English state to realise the ambitions of the Acts of 1652 and 1653, but it was also against the will of Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, and in the battles between Ireton's friend George Lawrence and Cromwell's friend Vincent Gookin, or between his hard-line son-in-law Charles Fleetwood and his soft-line son Henry Cromwell, Oliver regularly and systematically sided with those who sought to moderate the settlement. The outcome is still stark, dramatic, compelling. This map shows the amount of land transferred from Catholics born in Ireland to Protestants born in Britain or Ireland in the year 1653 to 60. Look at the figures for Tipperary, 77%, Meath, 76%, Westmeath, 75%, Carlow, 72%, and so on down. That's the amount of land confiscated, down to the low figures for Ulster, where so much land had already been confiscated. What Cromwell helped to achieve was an end to mass executions, an end to mass transportation, a lot of individuals protected under terms of surrender articles. Ireland may have been transformed forever by the events of the 1640s and 50s, but it was not transformed as those who created the Acts of 1652 and 3 hoped, partly because of the protests of Oliver Cromwell. Did the English overreact to the massacres of 1641? It was always my intention to ask questions and not to provide answers. Did the English overreact to what happened or what they thought had happened? Was the revolution in land ownership and in the cultural distribution of wealth and power a response vindictive or necessary to the scaled rebellion and massacre in 1641-2, or a response to the disintegration of the Irish polity in the years around 1649-52, a classic case of the law of unintended consequences? What alternatives were available to an embattled Commonwealth regime faced by a royalist problem in Ireland, much more than a Catholic problem? If I have indeed posed these questions rather than provided answers, that is in keeping with where we are today, with the launch of the 1641 Depositions website and exhibition. That website itself is a beginning, not an end, a moment of departure for a grounded understanding of thousands of human tragedies. The real work of purging false memory and establishing truth and reconciliation with respect to 1641 begins today.